me tilting to one side or the other.
Right, right. Okay, let me, why don't we start? I wanted to welcome everybody to this conversation about journalism, media, and race, and sort of the responsibility of reporters in this. Just as a Zoom tip, if you want it, at the top right corner of your screen, there's a little box that says Speaker View. And if you click on that, you'll be able to see the speakers as they talk. And that may be a little easier than trying to find everybody in what's going to be probably several screens of participants. So if you go on Speaker View, when I'm talking, you'll see me. When the panelists speak, you'll see them. I also want to let everybody know we are recording this. We're recording this meeting, and we're going to be posting it on social media and on the website afterwards. I just wanted to give you all a brief update about how the School of Journalism has been responding to some of the events of this summer, especially the ones involving race and the issues around racial violence and racism in newsrooms. We had a town hall shortly after the George Floyd incident and the protests broke out that was extremely well attended. I think we had more than 100 students there. And it was a really good and candid conversation about both the responsibilities of reporters, what we as a School of Journalism can do, what we can do better, and some questions from the students about how to move forward in their classes. And as a result of that, we've done a number of things this summer. We have set up a committee of students on diversity and racism that I've been meeting with to kind of get their input into how we can change things at the School of Journalism. We've done some hiring to further diversify our faculty, people who will be joining us in the fall. The faculty has spent a lot of time going over basically every class that we teach and looking for ways to incorporate questions about systemic racism, diversity, how issues of race are covered. So they're not just kind of in one class that you take, but in the course of learning reporting skills, writing skills, video skills, but the history of journalism, politics, sports, we're kind of making sure that these issues of race are very much at the fore. But one of the most important things I think that we're trying to do is to bring in voices and people to continue a conversation and a dialogue about these very important issues. And so I feel very lucky to welcome today three panelists, three alumni of Northeastern, and we very much wanted to get a range of alumni who would reflect a range of experiences. So we've got two recent alumni, journalists of color, who are out there now covering things, and Mike Frisby, who is an older alum, but who worked at the Boston Globe, the Wall Street Journal, and has a perspective, I think, looking back on how things have changed and how they haven't. I'm going to introduce the three of them now, and then I'm going to start by asking them some questions. The four of us will talk for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we've already gotten some terrific questions from many of you who submitted questions online. And if you want to submit other questions, just use the chat function, and we'll be monitoring those as well. Let me start out by interviewing our panelists. Tyler Blint-Welsh graduated in 2019. He's a reporter and photographer for the Wall Street Journal. He was hired as a national reporter. He now works for WSJ Noted, which is a digital magazine the Journal has just launched that's aimed at covering what it's like to be young in today's world. It's a perfect fit for Tyler because he's both a reporter and a photographer. During his co-ops at Northeastern and his internships, he wrote about music, sports, fashion for the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times. He just has a wide range of interests, and it's a sign of how the Wall Street Journal is having to adjust to this new world, that it's developing a whole publication now to try to bring in younger readers and also educate readers about what's going on among young people. Danae Bucci is another one of our recent alumni, just graduated in May, graduated virtually like everyone in that class. Danae is working as a television journalist in Savannah, Georgia, covering a whole range of things. Again, she had a terrific career at Northeastern. She won 2 New England Emmy Awards while she was here. She was an intern for Meet the Press and won a whole bunch of awards. Mike Frisby often says that he graduated in 1977 and probably couldn't get into Northeastern today. He's being modest, he certainly could, and he's spoken a lot to our classes and has been a friend of the journalism school for many years, often coming to classes and kind of sharing his thoughts. Michael and I got to know each other at the Boston Globe, where we worked together there. He then went on to the Wall Street Journal, where he was White House correspondent for 6 years, covering the Clinton administration, and won the Aldo Beckman Award from the White House Correspondents Association. He's now running his own public relations and strategy firm, and I give Mike full credit. I was down in Washington speaking to alumni back at the beginning of this year, and everybody was convinced that Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders was going to win the nomination, and Mike Frisby stood up and said, it's going to be Joe Biden, and he was right. So he's not only been a great reporter, but a great political prognosticator as well. So I want to welcome you all. And I wanted to start out by kind of getting your reflections of this moment and maybe talking in a personal sense of how this has affected you personally and also your reporting. And maybe we'll start with Tyler, because I know you had kind of a harrowing experience covering some of the protests in New York. If you could maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so I guess, so when the protests first started at the end of May, I got sent out on assignment to go take some photos, talk to some people and stuff. And on my first day going out there, I actually ended up getting assaulted by the NYPD with riot shields and physical assault by pushing me in the back. And I ended up like really hurting my foot and like ended up in a walking boot for like almost a month after that. And it was just, for me personally, it was just interesting and really scary to have been in that moment because, you know, it wasn't my first protest that I'd covered. I've covered protests in Boston and New York over the course of my time reporting. But this was the first time, you know, I'd really been faced with violence. And I think it kind of spoke to the heightened tensions of this moment that we're all living through. And for me, honestly, it still is like a really, really traumatizing experience. You know, like just thinking about it, the more I think about it, the more time that passes, you know, I realize that I haven't even been back to a protest since then. I haven't really had a desire to go back and cover those situations. And instead I've kind of shifted my storytelling focus to all the things that are happening outside of that kind of immediate tense situation. And I think that if not for that experience, I probably would still be out there, you know, kind of hammering down this protest coverage. But I think what that experience made me realize more than anything was how this issue is way beyond the protests and how all the things that are happening right now go way deeper than the protests. So personally, I think that's what I've learned so far, and that's just with one day, a few hours of protest coverage, honestly, throughout this whole thing. But it was definitely a few hours that I'm never gonna forget.
Did you feel you were targeted because you were a journalist, because you were a Black man? I mean, do you have a sense of, or was it just being caught in the scrum?
It's interesting because the officer that assaulted me was actually also a Black man. So I don't know if it had anything to do with race. It could have been like targeting because I was media, because I did have NYPD issues press badges, and I was wearing that pretty prominently. And one of the things with the press badge is, you know, you're supposed to be able to, the police are just supposed to like let you pass police lines if you're trying to leave. They're not supposed to kind of treat you like a normal protester. And I was actually just trying to leave. And I was saying, you know, my bike is locked right behind this police line. Let me go through. And the officer denied that. And he pushed me into a scrum of other protesters that were getting pushed back. And he just kept, you know, repeatedly beating me with his riot shield. It busted up my lip, broke my glasses. So I don't know what sparked it, but I do know that it was violence perpetuated by officers, and it was something that you saw throughout, you know, across the whole country, and you still see it going on now.
Right. Mike Frisby, let me ask you, when you hear those stories, I mean, what's your sense as a journalist who's been doing this for a long time, both when you reflect on what it was like for you in Boston, which clearly had a lot of racial tension in the 70s and 80s, but also kind of what it says about young journalists starting out today?
Well, first off, when I heard Tyler describing what he had been through, I immediately started thinking about, gee, you know, I mean, I was a journalist for 22 years. When in my career did I ever have to deal with something like that? And I think it's interesting that what came to mind was being in Red Square in Russia when I was there with Clinton during a visit, and the Russian authorities got very rough with the American reporters. So basically what I'm saying is that the situation that you're seeing on the streets today with reporters and protesters being treated the way they are, it kind of relates to what Russia was like, you know, back in the 90s. And I think that ought to, you know, that ought to worry some Americans. You know, I think the difference between what I went through as a young journalist, you know, I was in Boston during the busing scandal. Back in the early 70s. That was when people used to drive down the expressway behind the Globe and shoot bullets into Tom Winship's office. Winship was the very liberal editor of the Globe back then. I mean, it was an opportunity actually for me, because the Globe had some Black reporters, but they didn't have anybody who really knew the streets. And so I was the guy they call on to go into the projects and, you know, interview people in the projects because, you know, I knew the language. I could, you know, I could handle myself in that environment. And, you know, basically when I was a sophomore at Northeastern University, I got stories on the front page of the Boston Globe, you know, because I was able to go down and talk to the people. The situation today, though, I think the most astonishing thing, and it's more about the protests than the journalists, is how many whites are out there. You know, we're talking about Black Lives Matter. We're talking about police brutality, mainly against populations of color. And, you know, in many cases, the dominant members of the protesters are young whites. And quite frankly, I don't see this written about enough, but I think this has really impacted how President Trump is dealing with this. I think that if he could have had images of a number of Black and brown protesters burning and looting, that's what we would be seeing in his commercials right now. But because there's white kids out there, you don't see it quite as much. And so I actually think that that's taking away from what they thought was going to be an opportunity. When they sent federal troops, well, not troops, but when they sent federal agents into Portland, I think they were looking to incite a situation that they could take advantage of politically. And it's just a little bit more complicated and difficult to do that when the protesters are majority white kids.
So Danae had to step out to do a TV spot. She's a real live working journalist, but she's going to be joining us back in a few minutes. So Tyler, let me go back to you. And, you know, you got hired because, you know, you had a great portfolio coming out of Northeastern. You had a number of job offers. You had done really good work. Now that you're in the kind of real world again, and in a newsroom, do you find that your race affects how people see you, how you view your job? Or can you, you know, I'm a reporter and that doesn't matter? How do you kind of connect those different parts of who you are?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if my race played a role in how people view me, because that's not an unheard of concept. But, you know, especially in media, which is, if you look at like any kind of mainstream media organization, it's like overwhelmingly white, not just in terms of like its staff makeup, but in terms of leadership. So, you know, kind of top down, it's a white perspective that dominates these institutions. But me, I try not to focus on that. What I do have control over is the fact that I'm in this space, and that I have a platform, and that, I get paid to write stories. So as long as I'm coming up with ideas that are seen as good, and that are seen as things that people want to read, it doesn't really matter how I'm perceived because of my race, because my work can speak for itself. So I try not to let that even be a consideration in my mind, although I know it's a thing. But I do let it, inform my storytelling. I do recognize when, being Black might be an advantage. And I do recognize when, being Black might make an editor think differently of a pitch or something like that. But it's not really something that I think is healthy to let kind of cloud your mind in that way. So for the most part, I just try to focus on, what I have control over. And it's the fact that I have a platform of the Wall Street Journal to kind of share information with readers.
Right, okay. Danae, welcome back. I know you had to work for a living for those 5 minutes, so we understand. So can you talk a little bit about you? I mean, you just started. You're proof that recent graduates get jobs in journalism, which we love. So can you talk a bit about what your experience has been like, and especially when the protests erupted? You're in Georgia. So what's it been like there, and how does it compare to, say, working in New York or being in Boston or Colorado, other places that you've been?
Yeah, no, I think I came into journalism post-grad at probably one of the craziest times anyone could come into journalism. Just to put it into perspective, when I started, that was just as the George Floyd protests were starting out. So I got kind of the mid to tail end portion of all the protests happening, which quite a few did happen here in Georgia, and especially in Savannah, as it is the second largest city in Georgia. And then, of course, we have the coronavirus pandemic happening on top of that. I think how it's kind of informed, or it's been a quick on-ramp into the career, if you could say. Like, I don't think anything can really prepare you into being thrown into those two very different situations. And especially having to do it while also being a Black woman in the industry that's not super minority dominated, something that I've had to deal with. Luckily for me, I feel like my coworkers have been super open and accommodating. And if I have any questions or if I have any advice, from literally anything to, can I wear my hair natural on air if I choose to? And they're saying, oh yeah, of course, like no one's really gonna have a problem with that here. And I was also very concerned about not being able to cover certain stories, because I've heard of other stations that won't let Black people cover the protests or anything like that because they're concerned that they won't be able to remain objective when covering Black Lives Matter protests. Luckily for me, I haven't felt like anyone's thought that I couldn't do certain stories because of my race, but I know that that can be a problem in some places. But yeah, it's been a crazy couple of months with the coronavirus and then the protests and everything, but it's been fun so far, and I'm very glad to be here in Georgia, because it seems like a lot of stories kind of break out of here, because we have Brian Kemp, who does crazy things all the time, and then no one believes in coronavirus, so that's also great.
Have you though run into this question of people, if not at work, but viewers or others, having expectations or stereotypes about you, your political views, because of your race?
Yeah, I've actually run into an issue where that's actually come up. So it was a couple of weeks ago, I was covering an apartment fire that happened in a rougher side of town. It wasn't the nicest area, predominantly Black as well. And when I showed up, people were just being extremely rude to me. They were saying, like, you are fake news, all of this stuff. And it came to this point where I was like, I feel like almost people see me as a journalist first and don't see me as a Black person who's trying to cover something that's happening in their own community. And while I do agree that you hear a lot with local news, especially, like, you only come to the bad neighborhoods when there's a shooting or a fire, which I do agree that that's a problem and that we should cover when good things happen in those neighborhoods too. But in that moment, I was really frightened, and it felt like they didn't care that I was trying to tell a story for their community to help people. Because I was going to go from an angle of, oh, the Red Cross is letting you donate to these families who lost everything. And I ended up actually having to leave the story. I couldn't go live from there because I just wasn't safe and I was by myself. So I think it's really interesting when you think of it that way, where people don't care if they have kind of, like, I felt like we could have connected more almost, because it's like I wanted to help your community because I myself am from that community. And I see myself as a human being first, not a journalist first. So as a human being, I'm going to do what I can to help a community that I empathize with and I see myself as. So yeah, I don't know. It's been very interesting.
Mike Frisby, before we started, you said that you thought that whites don't understand, or maybe people in general don't understand, how hard it is to be a Black reporter in a newsroom. Could you talk more about that and maybe how it reflects your experience, or as you mentor people in the business, what you've heard from, reporters of color?
Sure. I mean, I think that, and again, this is something that, you know, white journalists generally don't have to go through at all. But if you're a Black journalist and you're doing your job and you report a negative story on someone who happens to be Black in the community, you know, sometimes you got to deal with that backlash. Sometimes it might be from, you know, your neighbors. It might be from city officials. But it's just it's a concept that white journalists don't have to deal with. I always use the example of, you know, back when I was the City Hall bureau chief for the Globe, I did stories on a city treasurer. I think his name was George Russell. He was African-American. And, you know, he was skirting the law a little bit by getting, you know, some early information about tax properties and was taking some action on that. And, you know, it was totally unethical. I wrote a big page 1 story about it. And then the next day I started getting phone calls from all the Black leaders in town, who, you know, people I knew, but they were like, Frizz, how could you do this? How could you write this story about George? And, you know, my response to them is one that I think, you know, Black journalists just basically need to take. And basically what I say is, look, I'm an equal opportunity ass kicker. I kick your ass if you're Black, I kick your ass if you're white, I kick your ass if you're green. That's what I do. And, you know, quite frankly, I've been able to, throughout my career as a journalist, everybody knew that about me. Everybody knew that it didn't matter if you were a Democrat or a Republican. It didn't matter if you were Black or white. I was an aggressive reporter. And, you know, I would do whatever it took to get the story. On the other side of the fence, I think the problem with today's journalists is, quite frankly, too many of them are too egotistic and arrogant. And I think that adds a bit to journalists getting a bit of a bad name. The thing about me was I could write a bad story about the Clinton administration, and that evening, me and Mike McCurry could go out and close a bar together. And so that allowed me basically to do my job. But, you know, getting back to your question, I do get a sense that newsrooms are changing, that because there's been a generational change since we were in the newsroom, Jonathan, I think that there are editors now who understand Black reporters better than back then. I remember when I started out in Dayton, Ohio, I had a city editor. He wasn't a bad guy, but he was so uncomfortable being around a Black male reporter that he used to have to wave his hands over his head every time we had a conversation. So if I came up and sat next to him, we were talking about a story, he was so uncomfortable that he'd have to, you know, wave his hands over his head. Now I noticed this, and, you know, occasionally I probably used it to my advantage. Oh, let's go make Brad uncomfortable, you know? But, you know, I don't think that you have those kinds of scenes as much in newsrooms anymore because people have evolved. I think that, again, I think editors are a little more sensitive now to some of the challenges that journalists of color face. Although you still have incidents like it was, you know, earlier this year in Pittsburgh, the paper in Pittsburgh, where a Black reporter was covering I think it was the Floyd aftermath stories, and her editors took her off the story because they didn't think she could be objective. You know, I think that type of leadership in a newsroom is ridiculous.
So let me ask all of you this question. There's been a big debate that's going on now, and we're going to be addressing it a lot in our classes in the fall. It's sort of the debate over objectivity. Wes Lowry, a very well-known reporter for the Post, and now I think he's at 60 Minutes, African-American, wrote an article in the Times which basically said that not only have newsrooms not been very diverse, but that their mentality has been kind of driven by a white perspective on the world. And the idea of objectivity and some of the rules that we live by have been shaped by that. And I think one of the things our students were asking us during the town hall was this question of neutrality and objectivity. And I'm wondering how the three of you kind of have dealt with that, and are your views changing? I mean, there is a sense out there, I think, and we see it playing out at the Wall Street Journal, at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, really everywhere, the Boston Globe. Newsrooms, especially the younger reporters, are challenging their editors, challenging them on hiring, challenging them on perspective, and it feels like there's a cultural change going on. So Tyler, let me kind of ask you that. I mean, do you feel, I mean, again, it's still early days, but do the younger reporters feel more empowered now? And do the journalists of color feel more empowered and perhaps changing some of the way newsrooms look at the world?
I think empowered would be a strong word, because ultimately, since May 25th, there hasn't been like wide scale institutional change, you know, that created power out of nothing. You know, these are still like conversations that are happening. There's still fights being had to even like make your perspective feel like it's being heard. At the Journal, you know, some staffers have written letters to the publisher and the editor-in-chief. I was a signatory on 2 letters. One was about hiring practices, about the fact that, you know, the Journal is, I think, there's 7 Black staff reporters at the Journal, you know, which is totally unacceptable in 2020. You know, there aren't any editors at the Journal that are of color. Sorry, there's 1 editor of color at the Journal that reports directly to Matt Murray, who's the editor-in-chief, which I also think is unacceptable. And then when you look at, you know, the different teams, you know, the US News team or the politics team or the business team or the tech team, you know, there's almost no Black editors. So I think it's hard to say that anyone's been empowered over the last few weeks or months, but I do think that, you know, newsrooms are being forced to reckon with, you know, decades of their hiring practices, decades of what they've created as this kind of idea of objectivity, to go back to what your initial point was. And I think that to an extent it's shifting, you know, like on the Journal, we're hiring on our standards team, which kind of, these are the editors who define, you know, if we're going to call something racist or like racially tinged or, you know, stuff like that, you know.
Or capitalized Black.
Right. You know, so that team is, they're hiring a Black editor for the standards team, which is, you know, I would say a huge step forward, because now you'll at least have someone on this team who can, you know, better inform these decisions. So if the president says something that is perceived as racist, you know, there's going to be someone in the room saying, you know, we shouldn't use racially charged or racially tinged or whatever. We should just use the word racist. But, you know, it's complicated. And I think it would require people in power, you know, relinquishing some of that power. So it remains to be seen if that's gonna happen.
Yeah, if I can just add an anecdote to that. When I worked for the Wall Street Journal, which was about 10 or 15 years ago, I was a senior editor on Page One, running the Saturday Page One, and we were going to be running kind of an illustration for a story. And I remembered looking at it and thinking, I don't know, I wonder if this is racist. It had kind of some caricatures, and it just something kind of, I thought, I'm not sure this is right. And I basically went out into the newsroom to try to find some African-American reporters or editors to kind of run it by them. The same way, you know, I'm Jewish, and if someone had a question about is something, you know, anti-Semitic or something that might want to run it by me. And I remembered walking around the Journal newsroom, and all I could find were two Black secretaries who I could talk to and kind of show them this. And they said, no, we're fine with it. But I went back to my office and I thought that's a sign of you know, a newsroom that's not really engaged in the world if you can't even find people to have those conversations with. Danae, what about you? I mean, what's been your sense? I mean, you know, does it feel like as a young journalist, you can be more outspoken? 15, 20 years ago, I'm not sure anybody would have dared write a letter to the publisher complaining about something. What's your view about that? And also for the journalists of color who you work with or who you know in the industry.
I think there's a little bit of a disconnect between people who are editors because they're traditionally a lot older than people who are just starting out, obviously. And I feel like a lot of younger people go into journalism now with a sense of social justice meaning behind their reporting, whereas when people who were of an older generation, it was more of this straight down the middle objectivity, have to report both sides, which has gotten us into trouble in a lot of circumstances. Climate change being a big one, they treated it as if like people who didn't believe that climate change and climate change people were the same when there were only like 2 scientists that believed climate change wasn't happening. So I think that's where we get into a lot of trouble or problems with our editors. It's just because editors have a different philosophy behind journalism. And I know for myself, I do believe that journalism could be a tool for social justice and social justice activism. That's kind of why I myself am very interested in journalism, because I want to give a voice to people who don't traditionally have a voice. And the way I kind of work around that is and obviously this is a privilege and I don't think every newsroom is like this, but I make a point every week. I pitch, 4 or 5 stories that have to do with some sort of social justice background, whether it be covering a good story out of a bad neighborhood. Here in Savannah, I haven't been here that long, but the first week I got here, I made sure to find the local NAACP chapter, and they know who I am now. So anytime there's anything going on, I'm the first person that goes there. So I think as a young journalist, is kind of finding stories that fit into not necessarily a narrative, but fit into a group or like a construct that you believe in. But then obviously I'll send my stories to my editors, and something that I write that I think is objective and fine, they'll take it out. So it's kind of a give and take there. And I have, advocated for stories or for things in stories that they've taken out and said, oh, well, this isn't objective enough. And I'm saying like, oh, well, I think or I try to meet them in the middle is what I'm trying to say. So obviously it's very annoying and frustrating when you feel like you can't do your job to the ability that you think that it could be taken to. But I think we're slowly chipping away at it. And I've even seen editors, come to terms with, okay, yeah, like we haven't done enough fair coverage of this certain thing, so we need to start doing it. And luckily for me, the newsroom that I'm in, it's very, very diverse. My former news director who just left last week, he was a man of color. I believe he's Indian. And then my current news director, he's half Black. We have an executive producer who's Black. And then a number of the reporters are also Black. So I'm very lucky. I think that's also kind of because I'm in Georgia, where it's more diverse in general. So maybe if I were somewhere else, it wouldn't be like this. But I think it's only opened my eyes to what this industry could be if every newsroom started to make an effort to make sure that they put people of color into these key positions to make sure that stories are told accurately and fairly for everyone, not just certain groups of people.
Mike, let me ask you this again from a bit of a kind of veteran perspective, which is we grew up certainly, and I think anyone who went into journalism in the 20th century, this idea of objectivity and neutrality and kind of leaving your politics at the door was a very strong thing. Do you see that changing, and how do you feel about it?
No, I mean, I still think that that's the way that journalism needs to be practiced. If you're working at a mainstream media outlet, one of the things where the lines seem to get crossed so badly today is that, there are a lot of advocacy media outlets out there today. And so reporters that work for, an ethnic newspaper, you can't hold them to the same standards that you hold to someone who works for the New York Times or the Washington Post, those reporters working for those kinds of outlets, it's their job to be advocates. I do feel very strongly that for mainstream journalism to maintain some type of respect from the public, you need to be neutral on issues. You need to, as much as you may sympathize with a certain political direction, if you work for a mainstream media outlet, you have a responsibility to objectivity. I want to go back to your last question, though, about racism in newsrooms. A few years back, W.K. Kellogg Foundation paid me to do a study on racism in the media. And one of the things that we found is that it shouldn't be surprising, is that newsrooms suffer from basically the same sentiments that are in the general population. And one of those is, unconscious bias. People in news positions make decisions based on the way that they were raised, based on who their friends are. So if the majority of editors are white, they're going to tilt in that kind of direction. A couple of one of the examples that we came up with in the study, Greg Moore worked on the study with me. Greg was former editor of the Denver Post and was managing editor at the Globe. This was there was some media coverage of Katrina. And there was a picture, AP did a picture of a white family kind of rolling down the floodwaters, carrying groceries. And this guy was getting groceries to feed his family. And then, a couple of days later, they showed a picture of a black guy basically doing the same thing. And he had looted. Okay, he had looted. Whereas the white guy was just trying to feed his family, the black guy had looted. But those are the kinds of things, and this is all due to an editor who looked at the picture and came up with a caption for a picture. And so I think if we're going to expect newsrooms to change, we have to expect our society to change and basically recognize unconscious biases there, and that is something that needs to be dealt with. Now, just one other thing that doesn't get talked about much at all is, and again, we found this in our study, is the sourcing of stories. We went through, hundreds of stories from major newspapers and found there was a huge imbalance when it came to who the reporters' sources were, both on the record and off the record for stories. I think it was something like 7-1 in terms of white sources to sources of color. And so think about it. If you're a reader and you're reading a story in the New York Times and everybody quoted in the story is white, wow, you're going to think white people are the only experts on that particular topic. And so that is one way that the media really spreads perceptions in our society. And, I think those are the types of things that need to get addressed, for the media to really play the role it's supposed to play of being objective in delivering the news.
If I could jump in,
Sure.
You mentioned something that I've also thought about a lot, is this idea of the role of media and in being objective and how to kind of balance your unconscious biases. And I think that the idea of objectivity, while it's key to kind of people's indoctrination into journalism, I think that holding it up as this end-all be-all ultimately ends up being damaging in the long run, because what it advocates for is this view of the world that is decontextualized from the things that are happening. So if every story you write has to take this so-called view from nowhere, what ultimately happens is all your stories exist in a vacuum in which poverty, racism, sexism, misogyny doesn't exist. Because if you acknowledge those things without acknowledging the other side, then all of a sudden you're biased and you're not objective. So I think that you know, instead of kind of advocating for this decontextualized view of the world so that you can write a better New York Times article or a better Wall Street Journal article, I think that what makes more sense, and which is what Wes Lowry kind of gets at in his view, is this idea that, you know, you should be upfront about what your biases might be, conscious and unconscious. And you know, as a reporter in this day and age where your faces are part of the story, if you go to the New York Times, the reporter's face is there. You can click on it. You can go to their social media. You can go to their Instagram. That's not a thing that used to happen. So, you know, the reporter as an individual is being injected into the story, whether we like it or not. And it's something that readers, you know, are expecting nowadays, because journalism, when you look at it, journalism it's competing with Netflix and Twitter and Facebook. It's not competing with books and other magazines, you know? So I think that, you know, we have to be aware of the ways that the world is changing around us, and we can't expect journalism to abide by the same foundational principles, because those foundational principles were based in a world that just doesn't exist anymore.
I totally disagree. I think the problem with your viewpoint, from my point of view, now remember, I'm an old guy, but so if journalism takes on and basically acts the way that you are describing it, then the readers out there, they're going to look at it and they're going to be yelling more fake news. They're looking for what readers expect a reporter to do is basically do a good job telling both sides of a story. I'm not saying objectivity means you tell a story with blinders on. I never wrote stories with blinders on. My stories were well-reported stories that told the readers what was going on. See, I think one of the main problems with journalism today is people are mistaking the advocacy that goes on, and I think there's a role for it and there's a place for it. But unfortunately, the readers are confusing it with mainstream journalism. And so that's why when I'll just say a Slate comes out with a very anti-Trump article, that's why there's such a reaction to it from a segment of the population, because they look at Slate and they're treating Slate as the same standards that they expect from the New York Times or the Washington Post.
Michael, let me stop you for 1 second. Danae, your eyes widened at one point. I kind of wanted to bring you in on this.
Yeah, no, well, I think I've been saying this, I think, for years at this point. I feel like what you're hitting on right now, Mike, just proves that there needs to be education at such an early age for kids about media literacy. Because I feel like if we had media literacy training for kids so that they are able to differentiate Slate from CNN, from Fox News, from the Wall Street Journal, from the Washington Post. And I think that's what this all boils down to. I think that the media in general, I hate using that word, the media, because what is the media? It's too broad. But when people see one news source, I should say something, that puts us all under hot water. And I don't think that one organization who does their job irresponsibly, in my opinion, should be the reason why we should all not try and create an objectivity or a neutrality that's truly neutral or truly objective.
I think Tyler is raising sort of a different point. The part that I found striking was this idea of we are competing for people's attention. And so you've got Twitter and TikTok and, you know, all the kind of social media out there. And it seemed to me, Tyler, part of what you were saying was journalism needs to maybe adjust its tone or somehow recognize that world. I remember talking to Katie Kingsbury, who's now the editorial page editor of the New York Times, when she was the deputy managing editor at the Boston Globe. And I was saying that I was struck by how a lot of the stories in the Globe seemed to have they weren't objective anymore. They weren't as balanced. And she said, well, what you call bias, we call attitude. You know, we call tone. And I think that's maybe the divide here. So it's not, I didn't get a sense Tyler's calling for things to be, you know, biased or bad journalism. It seems to me what you're saying is that the approach has to be different, or the context has to be different?
I think that's exactly it, because, you know, in 1985, you were writing to be read in, people are consuming what we're putting out in a totally different context than they were for the last, whatever, 5 decades. So I think that journalism today has to be cognizant of that, and it has to better reflect the tone and the language in which we're discussing the world around us. And I think that by kind of relying on these old ideals of objectivity and not kind of bringing them into the future with us, you know, journalism is a shrinking industry for a reason. It's because journalism at large it believed that its ideals were enough to sustain it. And we're seeing that that just wasn't true. So I think that, you know, it's arrogant for journalism as an institution to believe that doing things in the way that they did it in 1985, 1975, and 1965 is going to cut it today, because people ultimately don't want that, and they don't need it, because they can go literally anywhere else for information and for entertainment and for things to pass their time with. And there's just way more competition these days. And I think that's an uncomfortable truth. And I think that to an extent that is, that's kind of poisoned the kind of the value of journalism in a lot of people's eyes. But I think that it's something that is worth discussing and wrestling with.
Well, see, I think...
Wait, hold on, Mike. Danae, what do you think about that? Then I'll come back to you, Mike.
Well, I agree with Tyler. I definitely agree with Tyler. I feel like the idea that journalism can stay the same, like no industry has been able to stay the same throughout this many years. And I think journalism has probably stayed the same longer than so many other industries that have had to change because of technology. Now we're faced with, like you said, you know, like TikTok, all these other apps that are competing for people's time and their minds. It's going to have, like, something has to give, because we can't just keep it the same and then expect the people to continue to come to us when they have all these other things. So yeah, I think Tyler says it so much more eloquently than me. So I agree with Tyler, though, definitely.
Okay, Mike.
Okay, I don't think I quite agree with Tyler. Look, my issue is, what I care about is the standards. And so, you know, I'm not going to argue with you that newspapers, for instance, are losing readers because they're, you know, they're stuffy, they're staunchy, they're not as flashy as, you know, reading on social media or reading other stuff online. My concern is that these online media outlets that are growing, they don't have the same standards that, you know, your traditional media had. And because they don't, that's why I think there's such a growing opposition to media, because it goes back to people are now looking, like you were saying, Danae, people look at those things and say media, but they're not really media as we traditionally think about media. The other thing is that I think you probably want to differentiate a little bit between journalism and newspapers. Newspapers are obviously declining for a lot of socioeconomic reasons. You know, advertising isn't there. It costs so much money to publicize a newspaper. Whereas I do think that there is still both a need in our society and a desire for our society to have some type of medium that, with standards, that reports objectively on what's going on out there. I don't think we can go far as a society if there's not some type of medium that basically is going to tell a non-tilted story. As much as the more we tell tilted stories, the more one segment of the population is going to have a backlash against that particular media outlet. That's, I mean, you know, that's why Trump can get away with calling stuff fake news, because let's face it, there's been enough irresponsible reporting out there, not by, not by the New York Times and the Washington Post, who are the ones he uses that term against, but by other types of mechanisms giving out news that allows him to do that. And so I want to take that away. I don't want him to be able to throw a nasty label like fake news at the New York Times and the Washington Post. But the only way for that to happen is for these other outlets either to have standards, or as Danae was saying, there has to be more understanding of what is real news delivery and what is something that's advocacy, that's entertainment. And right now we just don't have that differentiating going on.
No, so let me, I want to shift it a little bit, and I want to talk about whites and white journalists, because one of the things that came up in the town hall, the School of Journalism is, largely white. We don't have, the kind of diversity that we would like. It doesn't reflect Boston. It doesn't reflect the country. And so one of the questions that was coming up from students, and I think this is something that even white reporters are asking themselves, what is the role of whites in newsrooms in this time? In other words, Mike, you pointed out you were struck by how many, white protesters there have been. On the other hand, I've also spoken to white journalists who feel like I can't cover this stuff because it's not something that I can cover. The students, what's interesting is the students basically wanted to know, how do I cover it better? If I'm a white reporter and I'm covering a protest, or I'm interviewing someone who's been assaulted by the police, or I'm interviewing someone who's a victim of discrimination, how do I create a sense of empathy, but then retain my journalistic duty? How do I, can I be part of that conversation and part of covering that story? And I'm wondering, starting with Danae and Tyler, if you folks have thought about that, or if white colleagues come to you, if this is a discussion that newsrooms are starting to have.
Yeah, no, I think I haven't had any conversations with any colleagues of mine about this up until now, but I do think I can understand the fear of being a white journalist or a white person in general and not wanting to touch these topics because it feels like there's so much on the line, and it could, ruin your reputation with your friends, your family, or worse, your career, if you handle such important topics incorrectly and to no fault of your own. I just don't think, in general, people talk about things like this. I feel like the first thing white journalists should maybe keep in mind is, honestly, when I'm interviewing with people, I try to be as upfront as possible. If I don't understand something, I will literally say, I want to let you know, I'm not trying to be rude or mean or anything through any of my questioning. I just, frankly, I just don't know a lot about this topic. And at least up until now, people have been very receptive to that. And if I say something incorrectly, or if they don't like the way I characterize something, they'll correct it. And then that's it. That's the end of it. But I think a lot of the trepidation behind covering stories like this is rooted in fear, which I don't think is a good enough excuse to not cover things like this. Just because you're afraid of what you might say or the way you might show a certain group or whatever doesn't mean that you shouldn't cover the story. And if anything, that's doing more of a disservice to them in the long run than helping them in the short term, because you may have gotten the story just a little bit wrong the first time you tried it, So I think kind of trying it, I get it, it's scary. I've told stories that I've been I'm way in over my head, I have no idea what's going on. But you just kind of have to get over it, because the betterment of an entire group of people or whatever it may be isn't worth their detriment because you're uncomfortable with telling that kind of story.
Tyler? Yeah,
I agree. I think I understand where the fear comes from. But I think that it's okay to be scared, I guess, to get a story wrong. But I think, though, that one thing that that fear, I think, is rooted in this idea that they don't understand all Black people or all Latino people or all whatever, right? And I think that that's the idea that you just have to get out of your head that your story that you're about to write isn't going to be representative of all Black experiences, of all Latino experiences, because people don't exist as a monolith. So I think that letting go of this idea of like one thing I think is that like, I think that I've noticed a lot more stories about Black people that I wasn't seeing 5 or 6 months ago. Like I saw a story about like how Black people who are trying to sign up for therapy are like, you know, having trouble like finding a Black therapist who understands them. And I think that that's a super valid story to tell. And it was in the journal actually, which made it even more interesting to me. And I think that's a super valid story to tell, but I think that, you know, it's kind of towing this weird kind of gray area of trying to like write about Black people as this separate thing than people. And you never see stories about like the issues that white people face based on their race or like, you know, their whiteness. So I think that if you let go of this idea that every story about a Black person has to be about their Blackness or about race, I think that that would go a long way, because it'll free your mind from being worried about like, you know, filtering everything through this race lens that may or may not be there. At the same time, I think you have to be conscious about when race may or may not play a role. But that ultimately is a more personal thing that's based on your education and how much you really want to learn about these issues. And that's not something anyone can do for anyone else.
You know, I want to turn now to some of the questions we're getting. We've gotten terrific questions from the audience. And actually this first one, Mike, I think is right up your alley back in your career before you became a White House correspondent. It's about crime reporting. I mean, when you were at the Globe, you really cut a huge swath through the newsroom, writing about crime, not just kind of, you know, the daily stuff, but kind of, you know, some major crimes and investigations that took place in Boston. And one of the questions says that, you know, crime reporting has always suffered from bias, particularly racial bias, in part because the first and sometimes only source for most stories is the police, who are not a neutral party. How can the media do better at covering crime and not be so reliant on police for their information and perspectives? This is something that I think is very relevant today as we're seeing, you know, cell phone videos don't lie, and it's kind of interesting.
Right. No, I mean, I took pride in being a very good police reporter in Dayton, Cleveland, and in Boston at times. Look, I think the key to it is being a good reporter. You have to have an understanding that the police have a perspective on every single situation, and that you have to go out and interview other people who have a different perspective. You have to interview the families of victims. You have to interview, you know, the district attorneys may think differently than the actual police do on an issue. So what it really comes down to is just being a good reporter, thinking about what other sources can provide you information so you can go back to the police. Now, going back to your initial statement there about folks concerned about police reporting, I always felt one of the reasons for that is, I mean, let's face it, lots of times, certainly back decades ago, when you read about a Black person in the newspaper, it was a crime story. And I felt that the problem was twofold. Yeah, we probably did focus too much on crimes, but there wasn't enough in the other pages of the newspaper about the Black community. So the crime stories stood out. You know, you didn't cover the Black community as thoroughly as you covered the suburbs. You didn't find, you know, Black recipes in the food section. You didn't find Black married couples in the society pages. And so, yeah, the story about Blacks on crime stood out because it was the only story in the paper about Black people. So I think that's been addressed a little bit today. I'll just tell one, you know, I love telling anecdotes. One of my favorite Boston stories, there was this 16-year-old Black kid named Palit. I don't know if you remember Koff, but this kid, he was like the best guy at stealing cars in Boston. So he would steal a car and he'd drive by the police station and taunt the police. And so one day they cornered him, and basically he got trapped, he got out of the car, and they gunned the kid down. And the coroner, this tells you how the corrupt mentality of law enforcement. I was on the story for the Globe. The coroner would not say where the kid was shot in his body. The police wouldn't say. I had to go to the, I think it was the Orchard, I think it was the Orchard Park Housing Projects, and sit with this kid's mother for 5 hours to convince her that we needed to go to the funeral home to basically have them point out the entry wounds to her kid, and which she finally agreed to do. And this is one of the reasons why Matt Storin, the former managing editor of the Globe and editor of the Globe, is one of my heroes, because he ran my page one story based on the funeral director telling us that this kid was shot in the back as he ran away. But, you know, that's, to me, and because I was involved in the story, it's personal for me. But that, to me, is the best example of how these institutions basically are racist. And that's how they group together. The coroner wasn't talking about it. The cops weren't talking about it. If they could have got away with it, no one would have ever been charged. No one would have been fired. But because the Globe stood up and ran the story, they had to face it. And I think ultimately, I think the family won like $3 or $4 million lawsuit against the city because of that. But to me, that's kind of the example of what we're up against even today in terms of getting institutions not to basically be blanketed racism on people of color.
So another question we have here, which is quite interesting, and we had a really good discussion among journalists about what our obligations are and how we do our jobs better. But this person says, how can news consumers, those of us who have either left journalism or are just, you know, reading, watching, listening to the media, hold newsrooms accountable for elevating anti-racism? What's the role of the reader or the viewer here? Do they have a role, and what can ordinary kind of civilians do in this? Danae, you want to?
Yeah, sure. I definitely think that there is a role of the viewer to make it known if they have valid displeasures about news. I think a lot of times people get kind of caught up in things that just aren't valid. So I think talking about, you know, I've noticed your newsroom is extremely white. Why is that? I think that's completely valid. People do read the emails that come in from viewers. It might not be as frequently as people would like, but they do get read. So I feel like, you know, emailing your newsroom or your local newsroom, whether it's TV or print, I think that could do a lot. Also, maybe if you want to, like, that I think is more long-term, getting more people of color into news might take longer because you have to actually hire people for that. But if there's stories that you know about that you want to see covered, because people are always saying, where's the media? Why isn't the media covering this? If you see things that should be covered, tell your newsroom. You know, we have our ear to the ground as much as we can, but I know for myself, I'm just one person. I can't know every single thing that's happening in Savannah and the greater area every single day, you know, and I am super thankful whenever people give me story ideas, because that's one less thing that I have to do throughout my day if I have a pitch that's already kind of made for me. So if you see things that you want to be covered, I think you definitely should reach out to local reporters or local newsrooms, just letting them know about it. And then that way, hopefully, there's more broad coverage of an entire area rather than focusing on just like slight sections of every community.
Tyler, what do you think? I mean, again, you're sort of at the forefront of this, right? The Journal's trying to engage younger readers. I think there is a discussion in newsrooms sometimes. We know how to deal with advertisers. We know how to kind of push back against that kind of influence. But, you know, reader responses, there's, you know, the New York Times has been the target of campaigns sometimes by readers. I assume the Journal runs into that too. What do you see as your relationship to your readers? And when your readers push back, or can they hold you accountable? How does that dynamic work?
I think that, like Danae said, the best way for readers to make their voice heard to a media outlet is to reach out. And that, you know, I do try to read emails. So I have a weekly newsletter for the Journal called Notes on the News. It's essentially like a news column breaking down the news of the week in a way that feels informal, conversational, and useful. And, you know, from that, I get emails all the time of people that, you know, either really like it or really don't like it or fall somewhere in the middle. And for me, it's really interesting. I think that the readers that reach out to me, though, they're not advocating for me to be more anti-racist. They're actually advocating for me to be more like conservative in a lot of ways, because, you know, the journal's readership is 60% Republican and 40% Democrat. That's just a statistical fact. So most of the people that read my stuff are on the right wing side. So a lot of people are reaching out to me like, hey, you know, you mentioned the protests in Portland, but I don't think you spent enough time focusing on the fact that they were, you know, throwing projectiles at police. Or I don't think that you spent enough time focusing on the fact that, you know, Black-owned businesses were being looted. And I think that, you know, stuff like that, it sticks with me and it makes me be more thoughtful about the information I'll include or not include next time. And just having the back and forth, you know, sometimes the way I'm describing it is not how they say it. You know, these people are always super rude a lot of times, and, you know, they call me names and I get crazy emails. But just responding in a thoughtful manner sometimes opens them up to a dialogue I found. And then now it creates a relationship between the reader and the journalist or the media outlet that they feel, it just creates a level of trust, even if there's disagreement there. So I think that always trying to engage with the news outlet is a good way to make your voice heard as a news consumer.
Mike, what's your view about that? Because you've been on both sides. I mean, you've been a journalist, but you've also worked in recent years in advocacy and mounting campaigns and working for nonprofits and for-profit companies and organizations. What's your view of does the media need to be pressured, and how do you pressure it? And is race and racism an issue that people could mobilize to create change in the media?
Yeah, I take a little bit of a different perspective. I think the onus should be on the media outlets to basically reach out more and create more channels for their readers to communicate with them. I think that would have a bigger, you know, impact if the media outlets made it easier for these folks to have some kind of, you know, feedback, more effective feedback. I know out in Oakland for a while, I don't know if they're still doing it, but, you know, they had experiments with community journalism out there, where I think they were like encouraging the community to actually write stories that were published. I mean, that's on the far end. But I mean, look, here's the reality. And I'm not proud of this, but when I was a reporter, I didn't want to deal with the public, you know? And I think if reporters speak honestly, at least from my era, I think that's the way they felt. Because most of the most of the phone calls that you got were people angry at you for what you had written. And so, you know, at the Wall Street Journal office in Washington, they were under instructions that Frisbie doesn't speak to the public. And so they would have to divert the calls somewhere else, okay? And, you know, think about it. When you got letters, when you were a reporter and you got letters, wasn't there a little concern about, what's going to be inside this letter if it looked a little strange or something? So I don't think that necessarily is the root. I don't think, you know, communication directly to the journalist is the root. I think it ought to be up to the media outlets to create different channels, new channels, where they can get a better pulse of what's going on in their community, where they can allow people to give feedback. Because look, think about all the mistakes that are made in newspapers that nobody ever catches because, you know, the public never raised enough of an issue about it. I just think that it would lead to a much better product if media outlets figured out how to be more in tune with the communities that they cover.
So here's a question, and I think it's something that, you know, we think about a lot as faculty in a school of journalism at a university. this person asks, how do we inspire hopefulness in young adults who are disillusioned by the extent of racism and violence in the world around them? Tyler, you started off talking about how, you know, a couple of hours of an encounter, you know, shook you, I mean, physically hurt you, but also I get the sense, you know, kind of affected you in a way that you're still dealing with. How do you feel about this question of being hopeful in these times with what we're dealing with? And what do you say to kind of students coming up who are trying to figure out what's my role in this new world?
I think it's a hard question to answer. I don't know how to make anyone feel hopeful, because ultimately that's really personal. But I think that one thing, I can only speak for myself, is one thing that I try to just focus on and tell myself is that everyone kind of has potential to make an impact, and everyone has a platform, and everyone, you know, everyone has a chance to make an impact in someone else's life. So I think that it's just on you to put out positive energy. But I don't know, that's a really tough question.
But do you feel in journalism, I mean, do you still believe in the mission of journalism, or as you're defining the mission of journalism?
I still believe in the mission of journalism. Otherwise, like, I'd be doing something else, you know, like, yeah, I definitely believe in the mission of journalism in terms of, you know, telling stories that aren't going to be told and helping present information to people that otherwise they wouldn't have been presented with, you know, and making it feel relatable and not out of touch. But I think that, I don't know. I think it takes a lot of energy to feel hopeful about journalism, because, you know, there's a lot of headwinds, there's a lot of challenges also. But I think that, you know, it's a super important mission. And I think the value of journalism and what it brings to the world, I think the fact that it's still, you know, the fact that we still have journalism is enough to be hopeful about, in my perspective. I think that it's just, I don't know. That was so inarticulate, so I don't know.
No, it wasn't. It was actually, I think, very poignant. I think it's great to hear your optimism, and the belief, as you say, journalism is still here, so it can still be used in positive ways. Mike, you know, you covered Clinton. You've been in Washington. You covered in a way the arc of history for this country that has seen us, you know, elect Obama, the first Black president, and, you know, all these changes, all the changes you talked about earlier that we see in newsrooms and society. Is Trump kind of a spasm that we recover from, or do you think he has kind of knocked the country in a way that we're entering a different kind of period for journalists and for the country as a whole?
Wow, you hit me with a political question. Look, I think most definitely his impact is not going to go away no matter who wins in November. He has made fundamental changes in our society. He has made it easier for racists, quite frankly, to be open about their sentiment. You know, if you look, Dan Baltz had a great piece in the Washington Post yesterday about the things that Trump has done internationally that you can't just turn the clock back on. The relationship with China. If Joe Biden wins in November, China isn't suddenly going to jump up for joy, because the confrontations that Trump set in motion, they recognize that a good percentage of the American public believe that way. So, you know, Trumpism has made an impact. You know, I think the question for our nation going forward is just how much of that do we want to roll back? How much of that do we want to continue? And quite frankly, I think we'll know that answer in November by, if Joe Biden wins, the size of his victory, And if Trump wins, well, the answer will be obvious. I want to go back to your inspirational question, though, for a second. Look, I think the way that we inspire young journalists is by talking about the impact that journalism still has in our society. How, you know, if you want, a lot of the change that we see is brought on because journalists did their job well. You know, they brought corruption to the forefront. They brought the need for change to the forefront. I mean, look, we're all inspired by, you know, the tragedy of George Floyd, but it's the media coverage of it that has really carried the day. You know, people would not be as engaged if the media had ignored the story somehow or some way. So I think that's what we use to inspire young people about why they want to be journalists today. It's kind of like, I don't know about you, but for Greg Moore and myself, you know, Woodward and Bernstein were our heroes. When we were young, that's why we wanted to get into journalism. That's why we wanted to be good journalists, to have the kind of change on society that those two reporters did. So I think that's the future of journalism. That's how we, you know, get young people to still believe in journalism and to engage in it, is by just looking at the examples of the impact that it's had.
Danae, now that you're back from your second spot, and I realize you've only been out of college for a few months, but being an alum basically gives you the right to start, you know, advising the journalists and students who are still here. I mean, what is your view of the future, and any advice you would give to journalists who not only want to go into journalism, but want to sort of take on these social issues? You said you yourself went into journalism because you had a social justice inkling. What would you say to journalists, white or journalists of color, both how to do that, what are the realistic expectations?
Yeah, no, I think my outlook on journalism, knowing that the crop of journalists under me, I feel like have kind of similar mindset to me, at least the ones that I know personally. I think the outlook is very bright. I think that with the philosophy that, I don't know how this happened, but somehow we have all seemed to get this kind of philosophy that seems to be a little bit different from the older generation. I feel like it's gonna breed a more fair version of journalism in the end. Right now, it might feel kind of radical, I guess some people would say, but I feel like in the end it's going to lead to us covering different neighborhoods more frequently and more fairly, and then hopefully also you'll see more people who look like Tyler and I out in the field and in powers of position, which I think ultimately is the ultimate goal. You know, diversity seems like such a no-brainer, but it's really not something that's actually being practiced in journalism enough, I feel like. So hopefully, I think for young journalists, you know, I get it. It can be annoying having to listen to people who you feel like don't understand you. But I think a lot of people have had to deal with that on a plethora of different things in the past. So I just would say, keep your head up, keep telling stories that you think deserve coverage and that you think are important. And if people tell you no, then you just need to find someone that tells you yes, and then it's done.
And then finally, kind of looking at the journalism school, your experience at Northeastern, and, you know, universities in general, but especially a journalism school. When you look back, what are the things you wish we'd done better or that you had learned? I mean, you're clearly getting an education on the fly now, but when you look back and think, this is something we should have covered, or this is something, you know, a university could have done better. Tyler, you want to go ahead?
One thing, I don't know how relevant this would be maybe to everyone, but I think one thing that I think should be taught to young journalists is how to advocate for yourself in a newsroom setting. Because I think the newsroom in like this traditional like mainstream media sense, so like the Times, the Post, the Journal, like LA Times, like it's dominated by you know, egos. Ultimately, like editors have this belief and the story has to be this way, one editor needs it to be this way, and you know, the photo editor is battling it out with, you know, the print editor about how where all this BS, you know, is going on, and your story is at the middle of it a lot of times. And I think that for someone who isn't comfortable speaking up for themselves, you know, that's where it's easy for you to get discouraged. That's where it's easy for your ideas to get watered down. So I think that one thing that, you know, should be taught in journalism school is, you know, really teaching people how to advocate for themselves and their ideas, and how to make sure that, you know, a story pitch is airtight, and, you know, that, I don't know, just those things are things that you can only learn through experience, but I think that an extra emphasis on it could go a long way.
Danae, what's your thinking?
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with Tyler. I think learning how to advocate for yourself is someone, I personally am very, very outspoken. So I feel like I'm always kind of like fighting for my stories, but I can definitely see how that's like super nerve-wracking and intimidating, especially in a new environment. So I think that would definitely help a lot of students. I also think in our, like in our classes like history of journalism, law of the press, things like that, focusing on reporters of color who kind of paved the way. I feel like we did touch on it, and obviously I took this class probably like 3 years ago at this point, so it's kind of hard to remember like what exactly we covered, but just making sure that it's as inclusive as possible, and not just talking about people of color, but obviously I think we should talk about LGBTQ plus rights in those types of classes and other kind of marginalized groups as much as possible, because obviously talking or inclusivity and diversity isn't just about black and white, it's about all types of people and all swaths of people. So I think that's also super important. But I must say, I think Northeastern University, the J school here, I think it's one of the best in the country, even though we might not get the national notoriety. I think that we shape some of the best journalists. I think that we have kind of one of the most progressive curriculums that I've ever seen. Just looking at my other friends who went to J school, I think we learned so much. And I'm so thankful that I went to a school that kind of fostered me into the journalist that I am today. And I can't wait to see where me and like all of my other classmates from Northeastern go, because I think that we're very powerful. So, so I'm just very thankful.
Yeah. Mike, what's your sense if you look back at what you learned, or maybe you got most of your education working as a co-op at the Globe, but what do you think young journalists need to know that they can learn in a college setting still?
Well, you know, I think Tyler hit on it, is that you don't, from classroom, you don't get enough of a sense of what the real environment is like in a newsroom. And, you know, it's not only just speaking up for your stories, it's how you relate to your other colleagues, you know, a recognition that, you know, in some newsrooms, you know, your other colleagues are your rivals. And so, you know, you have to be prepared for that kind of environment. I want to give you a little bit of a kudo, though, Jonathan, because, you know, it's so heartening to hear Danae and Tyler talk about their experiences at Northeastern Journalism School today, because in the 70s, it was not like that. To me, the biggest issue with Northeastern's journalism program then was its lack of support for students of color who wanted to be journalists. I have far too many classmates who wanted to be journalists who were discouraged by certain professors at that time. And, you know, it's just heartening to see how much that has changed over the decades, because you are obviously producing some extremely good journalists who are going to have a major impact out there. You know, kudos to both Tyler and Danae for what they are doing, you know, at such a young age. You know, I can't wait, you know, hope I'm around in 10 years, but I can't wait to look in 10 years and to, you know, look up and, you know, see Danae hosting a show on ABC Morning News, and haven't seen Tyler as, you know, an editor at the New York Times or something, you know. But I think, you know, those are the aspirations that they should have. And quite frankly, Northeastern has kind of given them the foundation to think big, to basically have the confidence that they can reach those kinds of heights.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much, Mike, for that. And Danae and Tyler, you know, reading through the chats, you know, people keep saying, you know, how proud they are and how striking so many things you're saying. And certainly, you know, I think I speak for all the faculty here that we're so proud that, you know, you made your home with us for a few years and learned enough and then kind of took it in these really exciting directions, and it's really great to see. And I think in a dark time, it actually gives all of us hope for journalism and for the country. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to the more than 100 people who signed up to join us. And everyone stay safe and stay well. And we hope to be doing more of these forums in the future, and we'll let you know. But thanks again. We can give you a virtual applause. And thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks, Goff. Take care.
Thank you, guys.
Take care, everybody.